I mean, it's not like it's not the best conversation when you're growing up with like, standard Asian parents who expect
Yeah.
you to go down a traditional career path, and you're like, I want to do this thing that like pays like a tenth as much, and like yeah.
Welcome to Inside the Scene, the show that takes you behind the curtains of StarCraft esports, sharing the stories from the people who know what it takes to turn passion into more than just a hobby. I'm your host, Drekken, and on today's show, let's start off with a question. How do you know what your calling is? This is deep, I know, but sometimes you go into a role thinking that this is what you were meant to do, only to ask yourself if that's really true. Today I'm talking to Kevin Dong, aka Monk, who started off making StarCraft 2 guides and providing pro coverage for Team Liquid. Even though he worked a traditional job, he found himself unhappy, as one often does, and when faced with the choice to go full-time esports, he made that leap. You would think to yourself, that's it, but soul-searching questions show up and he tries to figure out if this is what he should be doing and why. The answer isn't obvious at first, but it makes sense in retrospect. But yeah, let's not get ahead of the story though. Before all this, he's just a Pokemon trainer.
I definitely raised Pokemon to battle, and I think one thing that one of the reasons I play games is not necessarily to win, but to find out the best way to win. Not necessarily so that I could win, but so that someone in general could win. What I want to find out what the best strategies are and how to beat those best strategies and how to beat the best strategies. And I think that comes into my fascination with both Pokemon and just RTS in general, in that there are my desire, the reason I like them is my desire to find out how to be the very best, as it were.
The best that there ever was?
Yeah, best that there ever was. And not necessarily for myself to be the very best. And I think that's partly why I like esports, not necessarily for the idea of esports itself, but because it is an avenue for which I can use to explore what the best strategies are.
And like when you were doing Pokemon, did you like make guides? Like how did you express that through the Pokemon world? Like how did you help others get better?
I guess back in the day, in the very first Pokemon forums for Smogon, there was one called Pojo, and there's one called Pokemasters. These were back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, to date myself. But on those websites, I wrote some guides, I wrote some team reports, and even back then, I used Excel pretty heavily. I'm pretty known, like even around the company, as like someone who like is obsessed with Excel. So I like made spreadsheets of like what Pokemon did and what their stats were and what they could accomplish with their various attacks and whatever. And because of my fascination with Warcraft 3 esports, I eventually started watching a lot of StarCraft 1, like Pro League and and like OSL and GSL. But at the time, like because I was busy with college and whatever, I did not really interact as much with the communities. And I was more of like a kind of like a face, like kind of just a standard lurker in the background.
And then when we're talking about communities then, did communities come to you mainly in StarCraft 2? Is that when you started to get engaged in the community, or did you engage with the community earlier? Was there a time when you were able to like engage with the community before StarCraft 2?
Yeah, I think it really depends on your definition of community. I played a lot of custom games in Warcraft 3, for example, and I engaged with a lot of like individual like mini custom game communities back in those days. But I would say like with the context of like the game at large, I did not really interact with either the StarCraft 1 or the Warcraft 3 community back in the day. But I guess to your question, I did start engaging with like the community and like the wider game sense in StarCraft 2 And I alluded to this before, but the first time I engaged with the community was through guide writing, essentially. I wrote like back in the day when like Team Liquid was like the de facto place to learn about StarCraft strategy and just to talk about StarCraft in general before Reddit existed. I would write like just a ton of guides based on pro games that I would watch in GSL or an MLG, back in the old days, even IPL, if you can remember back that far. I would write strategies about write articles about these strategies, and that is how I got to develop like my initial starting relationships with both other guide writers and eventually like Team Liquid staff at large.
At this point, Monk is looking for more and more ways to contribute. He reached GM in the early days of Wings of Liberty and uses that knowledge to talk more about the game on the Team Liquid website, covering tournaments, and you know what, he even gets a chance to talk to the developers. His contributions accumulate to what I would call a guide writer's magnum opus, a 100-page plus guide on Protoss vs. Zerg matchup. With help from members of the community, they put together this massive post. This thing is extensive, covering early, mid, and late game scenarios, complete with pro replays, map considerations. It's impressive, and I kind of would want someone to do it again.
What was the emotions that went through your head when you decided you were going to write this guide? You wrote, this guide is like 100 pages. So what inspired you to like write this guide?
Oh, so you're talking about the PVZ guide, I guess.
Yes.
The big PVZ guide. Yes.
Yeah.
That was so that was like maybe like the 15th guide I wrote. And I guess there was like the initial guides, there was not really a lot of emotion. But with that particular like 100-page long guide in particular, it was kind of like it was not just me, of course. It was
it was a group.
It was a collaboration of a lot of different like other guide writers, both from like the Protoss and the Zerg side, and a lot of collaboration with people who are not guide writers per se, but people who are just StarCraft fans and had their own talents to share. Like for like a lot of graphics people, a lot of people who helped with like the organization and the formatting. And it was just like a cool community initiative that organically kind of came out, not because anyone really paid us to. No one from Team Liquid was like, oh, we'll give you like X amount of money to write this guide, but because we were all individually very passionate about the game, and about not only about the game in general, but also about sharing our love and our knowledge of the game at large as well.
How did the conversation go when you were asked to join Team Liquid?
Mm-hmm.
What was the conversation like?
It was definitely a very steady process. Back in the day, and Team Liquid was like, I know it's like, it's very hard to imagine these days, unless you're from the early days of a StarCraft audience, but Team Liquid is like huge these days. It's like a multi-million-dollar company. But back then, we were just like 5 people in a small apartment in Astoria, Queens. And
wait, you were there? You were actually in the apartment too, or were you?
I never lived in the apartment, but I often visited the apartment. Yeah, because I was pretty close by as well. But I remember it was like really scrappy kind of situation, and it's just like it's so interesting to compare what it was back then, where Team Liquid started, versus where it is now, where like I think the perception is that it's like a very corporate environment, and everything is very structured, and like they're one of I wouldn't say the largest, but they're definitely like one of the largest organizations. It's just such a stark contrast for me. But yeah, just walking into that, I guess I'm not very often surprised by much, especially in the esports world, because like you go in with like, I would say I personally went in at the time with relatively low expectations, and I feel like those low expectations were met. For better or for worse, I guess. Yeah, again, it was a very steady process, and I think I had to be very steadily convinced to like join full time. Like with a lot of volunteers back then, like we weren't paid, but we were given like some special perks. For instance, one of those was like whenever we got trips, like Team Liquid as a whole got like free trips somewhere. Like one of the staff would be, or one of the volunteer staff would be offered to go on that trip. And one of my first forays into Team Liquid is when I was offered a trip to go to China in order to experience the World Finals at the time. It was the year that they didn't have a BlizzCon, and it was called the BWC.
Okay.
This was the year when Parting won with his Immortal Century All-Ins, if you remember that. He beat Creator in the finals, I believe. He beat Sucky on the way. Yes. Yes, and there was a very infamous clip of me interviewing Dustin Browder at the time.
Hi, this is Monk from Team Liquid, and I'm here with none other than Dustin Browder, the man, the rock himself. And the second problem is that because of just one build in one matchup,
Right.
all maps have to be
very similar in how they're laid out.
Yeah,
Right. I could be wrong. Right.
So yeah, that was a great time, and it was like kind of my first foray into like what like a esports life could be like, for instance.
And at that time, when they asked you to join and to help with the Team Liquid, what was your thought process? Like, you obviously saw the apartment, you knew where this was going, or what it looked like. What was your inner dialogue?
So I guess at that it was about like where I was at that moment in life. I was like, I did like the standard Asian thing of going to like a college and like studying like a standard degree, and I was like, I was doing some like finance stuff at the time, but I wasn't really enjoying what I was doing. And Victor Nazgul offered like, hey, maybe you should just try this for a while and see how you like it.
And Monk said yes, taking more and more work from Team Liquid and getting paid to do it. Then in 2013, Monk gets himself a beta key for Hearthstone and finds out that he's good, like number 2 on the ladder good. So good that Team Liquid asks him to represent them, and for Monk, suddenly the path to pro seems like a possibility. There was even this time when he played against Artosis, the StarCraft mainstay, in ESGN's Fight Night competition, winning 3-0. Naturally, opportunities start showing up with Team Liquid looking to expand into this new game.
We were thinking like Hearthstone would become huge, and it did become huge. And we were thinking of starting like another sister website, which later became Liquid Hearth. So my job, my focus at least, was both starting up the site and also starting the Hearthstone team of branch of Team Liquid, basically.
It can be a time-consuming thing to, put into any startup, and that usually takes away from other things. So whether that be schooling or other job opportunities. And so what was maybe a dialogue with your parents on the topic?
I mean, it's not like, it's not the best conversation when you're growing up with like, standard Asian parents who expect you to go down a traditional career path, and you're like, I want to do this thing that like pays like 1/10 as much, and like and is like, no one knows what it is. Like, it's really hard, especially back in the day. Like, esports has come like so far in the past 10 years, but if you think about like 10 years ago, like it was really difficult to explain to someone outside of the space exactly what esports was. And I had this struggle every time. And eventually, like, what some people told me is like, just tell people you do games. Like, you like, I don't know, do something with games. So I guess that's where it came down to. But I think over the years that they did realize that I was not happy going down the path that I was, and they eventually came around to the idea that like, what was most important was like my happiness going forward.
The conversation with explaining to one's parents and then explaining to one's peers about what you're doing. And so there is pushback from the outside world. There's people who don't agree with it, who don't probably think it's a waste of time. And obviously esports is much bigger now, but at the time it's an unknown, right? It's this unknown and this possibly no money, lots of work, no money reward. And so what motivated you? Was happiness your primary motivation, or was there a idea that that you were looking to get a payout maybe at the end?
Me, I think one of my downfalls is I think very much in the moment and not very much like maybe 5 years down the road. Although I've gotten better about that over the years. I think especially then I was just like kind of hoping to discover myself a bit more, I guess, and seeing like where this all leads, and like again, like learning more about myself and see if this is where I wanted to go. And I think even if I only got that, it would have been like, looking back at my time in esports, I think that would have been worth it. Like some of the things I was struggling with was again, like finding happiness, discovering who I was, like finding out what exactly makes me happy. And I got a lot of opportunities in Team Liquid, traveling around the world, meeting different people, talking about like their perspectives on life, and like it's kind of like what you're doing right now to me, like finding out like how they got into esports, how they got into gaming, finding out what drives them. And it definitely gave me a lot of like more varied perspectives than I had like growing up, going through like very set paths, both in like high school and college, and like going out into the very traditional workforce. Right before I got hired by Blizzard, like maybe a year or two prior, like I was really like more questioning where I was going with esports. And I think one of the, like I alluded to this before, but like it was really the Wild West of like esports was a Wild West at the time, and it to a large extent it still is now. So I was really the uncertainty of what was going forward was what made me hesitate a lot. And I feel like in some ways I might have overcorrected in terms of going a very strict like traditional finance route to this like completely like new unexplored space that has very unknown potential, but at the same time has a lot of unknown risk, which is like fast forward a few years, which is why like I think right now like game development is kind of like the perfect in between those two. Where
is the game development the overcorrection, or you said you overcorrected? What would you?
I would say
overcorrection.
I would say going into esports at the time, I wouldn't say this is an overcorrection, but at the time I thought it might have been, which was going into esports and the very specifically the early time of esport, like how, because esports was still developing in its like first 10 years, some would argue, at the point at which I jumped in.
Right. You were at like literally the beginning era. And then, so the conversation you had with yourself, like, how did it sound like when you were coming to that almost that precipice probably to decide what your future might look like? What did that dialogue, that inner monologue sound like?
I wasn't really ever sure what I would be doing like 5 or 10 years from then. And after like 3 or 4 years doing esports related stuff, I guess I became a little more disillusioned in just how chaotic everything was. So it's kind of like one of those situations where like the grass is greener on the other side of the road, where like, it's this like finance career is like super stable, but it's very boring, and like I want like a career with more adventure and more flexibility. But then when you're on their side, it's like, oh my god, this is so scary, you know. So I guess that was what was going on in my head. So like I guess I would describe myself as Goldilocks, where like, you know, this finance bed was too hard, but this esports bed is too soft. I like this game development bed right here where I'm sitting.
And so you did a lot of volunteering that led up to getting into your first position with Team Liquid. And so how much does volunteering affect career trajectory?
Well, this is a very age-old question in the esports space. I would say that I can only talk about myself, and for me, I would not have gotten into the space at all if I had not done that volunteer work. But my goal was never to get into the space. It just more happened organically. So as I think if I were to give advice to someone who is looking to get into esports that is not in esports, it would be honestly the best way is to figure out what you want to do, get really good at that one thing, and maybe get really good at that one thing outside of esports. And if you're really passionate about esports, find a way to translate that skill set into something you can do for esports.
Oh, that's interesting. And that being really good, is that whether that be paid and unpaid? Are we just talking about developing the skill in general?
Yeah.
Like how? Okay.
Yeah. So for example, like graphic artists, like they might work for a big company first, and then they can transfer over to esports. Or I know like lawyers who get a law degree can get a law degree, and maybe they can like focus in esports, or they practice law in another sector, and then they move on to esports, or just like production in general. Like if you're really good at like production, and you might not even have to start with esports, or you can start in esports and get really good within esports in production and translate your skills into like a well-established company in production. But I would say the most important part is like if you want to get into esports in the long run, I would say my best advice is to hone a skill. And if you want to get into esports in the short run, my best advice is a lot of people hate to hear this, but like networking.
Networking, as in like, so was there a time where your network helped you get up, like move a little bit forward into the scene? Like,
yeah, totally. I think for me, just personally, I'm like, are
you a natural networker?
I hate networking when the goal is to network, but I'm naturally talkative. I'm naturally very friendly. So I guess that kind of stuff, like, I also hate to ask people for favors, but like, I make friends relatively easily. And like, just like opportunities come up all the time when they're like, hey, I know Kevin, or like I can help someone. And like, it's like, oh, I know this, like, this is a perfect guy for the job. So you just got to keep yourself in people's minds, I guess, is my advice.
Speaking to that, something that's been on my mind is how without the support of the Crown Club's members, shows like this wouldn't even be possible. Shoutouts to them, and if you're someone who wants to get more involved and got questions for our guests ahead of time, or just want to watch us record this show, go to ESChamp.com/join to become a member. Okay, so around this time, there's a change in StarCraft 2 that catches Monk's attention. Co-op mode. It's a mode that takes the traditional lonely game of StarCraft's 1v1 to a joint shared experience. Players are given control over commanders with abilities, and together they complete campaign-like scenarios. Monk puts his mind to it again and began speedrunning commanders, playing them to their greatest potential in order to provide guides for others. Sensing a chance to give back, he creates a co-op Discord to bring like-minded players together, and it grows. Also, StarCraft at this time had what was called summits. Blizzard would host an event around their BlizzCon, their annual convention, and invite content creators, pro players, and influencers to share their plans and take feedback. Even I got invited a few times, so it's not surprising that Monk was asked to attend, which is where the opportunity presented itself.
This one time I had I was at the StarCraft Remastered Summit, I remembered specifically. And I was like, I have some ideas for StarCraft. I don't know if like anyone wants to hear them on the StarCraft team. And initially what I thought was like, I had like an email sent up, written up, and I was just going to send it to the developers. But I talked to like Tim Morton, who is like my boss right now. But at the time he was the production director of StarCraft 2. He was like, oh yeah, just come into the office tomorrow and like present your ideas. And so I did that. And then like, the lead designer at the time, David Sun, was like, oh, are you looking for a job?
What was going through your head when he's just like, come in? Were you just like, sure?
Yeah, I feel like I guess I deal with pressure relatively well, and I didn't feel pressured at the time because I didn't think anything was really on the line. like I was like, oh, this is like kind of a little odd. I didn't expect this, but okay, I'll just come in and talk about stuff tomorrow. I had the intention of one day like forwarding this email, this set of notes, like 10 pages of notes basically to the dev team, but I basically just got an opportunity to present those 10 pages on that day, so that happened to work out. I was prepared before the meeting, even though I was not did not expect to present that document.
How did you react to that idea of being asked? Like, were you full on board with it?
I actually went through a lot of back and forth with myself, because I think like when as a kid growing up, especially like 10, 20 years ago, you often don't think of game development as a potential career path. You're like, what do you want to be? I want to be a doctor, or a lawyer, or a firefighter, or a policeman, or a teacher, or these days a YouTube influencer, right? But game development is kind of, number one, it's not a common job, and number two, I feel like it's very nebulous, and part of that is because game development, I think, is actually very different from studio to studio. So there's not like a one set defined list of responsibilities and like roles you can fulfill, especially as a game designer, as opposed to like an engineer or an artist. So yeah, it's one of those things where like you're given, like you're asked a question, and do you want to be a game designer? And I'm like, oh shit, I've never thought of this question. Like I've never considered this question my entire life. So I had to do a lot of like reflecting and like asking around. But very luckily, I knew a lot of people who were already game designers, and I asked them a lot of questions, and I did a lot of research into like what exactly this would entail. I actually had a different option at the time to move into a different esports related company. So that was kind of like a juncture in my life where I could have like essentially stayed in esports, but or moved into game development. And I chose like I wouldn't say one is like riskier than the other necessarily, but like I chose like game development partly because of like how, number one, I thought it was like a good mix of the Wild West and the stability I had been wanting, like kind of the middle of the road Goldilocks situation, and also because like working on StarCraft feels pretty cool, right? It's a game that I loved like throughout my entire life. I was very passionate about, and also I thought, like, thinking back on it, I think a part of it is like I didn't believe initially that like, why would I become a game designer? Like, I don't feel like I went to game design school, for instance, right? But thinking back on it, like I do think that like with where I am strong, and with my education and my background, and just my proclivity to like write guides and think about how the game works, how games work in general, I think it did make sense. So I think that's how I eventually got to my conclusion of like, I'm going to go into game development / game design.
Did you come to that conclusion before you made the decision, or is that retrospect?
I would say that's a good question. I would say a large part of it is beforehand, but I think it is much more clear to me that the logic in my decision making was sound afterwards.
Oh, okay. And then when you made the decision to apply and move forward, did you feel at that time confident in your skills in being able to do the role?
Honestly, no. But I think I got a lot of good like reinforcement from my team at the time. And honestly, like the first my role was in developing co-op commanders primarily. And with my first commander, I got a lot of help. I got a lot of like feedback. But overall, like I thought I did I think generally, I think I approach problems in an intelligent way, and I got a lot of good feedback. And like overall, I think it's with every new developer, you like build confidence over time.
Like with any skill.
Yeah.
Could you tell me a time that you felt in that role at Blizzard, in that beginning role, that you felt like an imposter?
Yeah, definitely a lot of times, especially like in the very beginning, where like your role is like your job for the day is to like come up with like gameplay ideas, and you just sit down at a computer and you're like, what do I type? Like, it's I think and I think to this day I still struggle with that in the sense that when the objective is to come up with ideas, and or when the objective is like more nebulous, and it's like for example, implement an ability is like relatively straightforward. You just like write the code or the script for it.
Right.
I think I approach those problems relatively well. Whereas like coming up with something more nebulous, I think especially for less experienced designers is more challenging. And those are the times where like maybe I'm not creative enough for this. And actually that is another part I struggle with. Like I did think I was like from a like logical reasoning perspective, I was pretty strong, but I always struggled with myself. I'm like, maybe I'm just like not creative. Like this is kind of art in a way, right? Maybe I'm just not an artist.
And what have you done? What have you implemented from that role to this role now that has gotten you to feel more creative or to help you be more creative?
I think part of it is like, instead of like just being more creative, I'm trying to approach it more similarly to how I approach any problem, which is like, how do you generate ideas? Like you do so in a kind of algorithmic way, in that first of all, you like list what has been done in the past, and like list out what you liked about each of those things, and list what you didn't like about each of those things, and then like say what you think could be improved on each of those things, and then for better for worse, like for better, you could say iterate on like past ideas, and that's like how you breed creativity in iteration. Or if you take a pessimistic view, you steal the other past ideas.
Did you ever get any feedback from someone in Blizzard or outside of Blizzard, on how to approach your role?
To be completely honest, I think relative to a lot of other design positions within Blizzard, I did not get the most feedback. And partially this was because like, I think I can say this now, like StarCraft was a relatively downsizing team. So in a traditional game design role, I think you have much more of a structure as a new designer, in terms of you have a lead, and then you have a lead. He has a lead, and then you have more peers, and then your lead has more peers, and they can all give you like greater loops of feedback. And I think that was something that I like going to other like bullpens around Blizzard. That was something that those teams had that was not necessarily the strongest within the StarCraft team, simply because of where the game was at with its lifespan at the time.
Okay. So did you feel then a little bit of a sink or swim at that point then, because you were maybe a little bit on your own?
No, I definitely wouldn't say like, okay, I think I phrased that maybe a little too negatively, in that like I still had much of a support structure. But a lot of the support structure was like a lot of us figuring it out together as we went along the way. So I never felt alone per se.
What surprised you most about the role?
I would say this is something that like, I wouldn't say this surprised me a ton, but one thing I do particularly enjoy about the role is how everything was different from a day to day. Like one day you would be like coming up with ideas for this commander, and next day you'd be actually implementing them, and the very next day you'd be working with a writer to write lines for the commander, or write a story for this commander. Next day you'd be working with an artist to like talk about like the visual design and what all these and writing prompts for all these like abilities should do and what the art should look like there. And then the very next day you'd be recording like voice lines with a voice actor. So I guess what is both surprising and what I enjoyed is like how diverse like the job really is, and how like every day was truly something different, which is not something that I think a lot of people can say about their jobs. So that's cool.
Much of Monk's work would be designing co-op commanders, having some of them being released under his watch. Also, you'd help out the Versus team. But in 2020, his path would change again. Remember Tim Morton, the StarCraft lead who first got Monk the job at Blizzard? He left and was starting his own studio called Frost Giant, with the goal to build the next great RTS. And he wanted Monk to come with him.
Yeah, I think for anyone that's worked with at Blizzard, and especially for those who came from a community within Blizzard, I think it's a tough decision to ask of someone. But in many ways, my personal decision was less tough because in many ways I feel like it's not. In many ways, I don't feel like I'm living Blizzard in a way, because Blizzard was never really about the company. It was about like the people, right? It's just like, Asgard. It's not, Asgard isn't a place.
It's the people.
That's the people.
Take me, Thor.
Yeah. So like, and on this new team, I basically like get to work with many of the same people that I worked with on the S2 team. So for me in particular, I don't think it was as hard as many other people who have had to leave Blizzard over the years.
You were on board right from the beginning then. Like you didn't have a hesitation. You obviously knew you were going to meet up with a lot of people that you already knew.
Yeah. I mean, that's not to say I didn't have any hesitation. Like I wanted to find out like more about like the project and like as with any startup, like how well capitalized is it? Like what's the stability like in the future? And to be honest, like it was not as stable as I would say it currently is right now. Like the future was a little bit more nebulous, but we were still like, we can do this attitude. And I talked about before about like my band of stability, which is like, oh, this was too unstable and this is too stable, but this works fine. And I feel like Frost Giant is like maybe slightly above Blizzard in terms of stability, but like it's still within that little band that like I kind of am uncomfortable in.
A little bit of a pushing there. And so what pushed you over the edge? What made you, because obviously you knew that there is, you need a certain level of things to help persuade you to jump onto this journey. As you said, it's like, it's more stable it's more stable now than it was back then. So you had some reservations. What pushed you over the edge? Like what made you make that final yes?
I think a large part of it was the idea of working on something new. I'd been working on StarCraft 2 for like 3 years at that point, just churning out co-op commanders. And even though every co-op commander is different, you still got the sense that like, if I'm going to stay on this team, I'm going to be churning out co-op commanders for the rest of my existence. And also the fact that like, if I were to get moved to another team, I'm not really sure what other team I would like. It would honestly probably be Hearthstone because of my background in Hearthstone, but I was more excited about the prospect of making a new RTS rather than working on Hearthstone. And as history can tell us, that's probably what would have happened.
That the chances of that seemed pretty high based on how things have turned out in recent events.
Yeah.
And thinking back to that now then, so you transitioned between working on Team Liquid, working then on StarCraft and Blizzard, and now working on at Frost Giant. What was the most significant advice that you received to help you grow between those roles?
I think it does relate to the idea of like imposter syndrome of like people on especially the StarCraft team telling me, oh, you're doing a good job. Like you're doing great. And reiterating the fact that like if they didn't think I would be good for the job, then they wouldn't have hired me. So I guess the idea of getting over like a sort of imposter syndrome if you're already hired for a role. Because especially as a new contributor, like no one expects you to do anything amazing at the start, and they expect a ramp up time. And I think that is very reasonable. And yeah, most people I would say 99% of people who feel like imposters aren't actually imposters.
And how did you come to that? Like, how did you come to the conclusion that, like, was that on your own, or did you have to bring that up to somebody?
I think it was both from feedback from from my peers, and also I think what is validating is like when you go to a convention or when you read the forums and people are saying like nice things about the work that you've done. And for a game, like I think it's especially motivating from like such a huge game as such as StarCraft 2, when so many people are kind of like enjoying the content that you've made, and like just conversing about the content that I've made. Like I think what is part of what is rewarding is like a lot of people are like theory crafting about content that I've made, similar to how I have theory crafted in the past about content, about StarCraft content. Like how do you optimize this commander? How do you play him the best, right? And that is what made me gradually grow more and more confident that, oh yeah, I guess I can do this. Right before I joined Blizzard, I was also questioning my career path at the time. So definitely there did exist up and downs, but I think number one, I think I'm very fortunate in how things worked out. But I do think overall, a lot of it has to do with like the opportunities that I've made for myself, and that I am generally outgoing. I will like I do like talking to people, so like people have me in the back of their heads a bit, and it's kind of like that extrovert personality that like kind of carries me through. Yeah, I guess my thing is all about like the opportunities that you make, the networks, everything in the end is a bit of luck, but there are opportunities to make luck for yourself.
Do you do that deliberately?
Do I do that deliberately? No, I don't do that deliberately. I think one of my strongest personality traits is that I make friends rather easily, and I like to talk to people in general. And to be honest, if I were an introvert, I think life would both be a lot harder, and I would probably struggle to like make the conscious decision to go out and try to like talk to people and make that luck for myself, as it were. So like, yeah, having looked back into my life, I've noticed that at a lot of points in my life, making that extra effort to talk to the extra person, to make friends with them, to get them to remember me has made a huge difference in the course of my life.
Bringing up getting them to remember you, what element in conversations help you stick in people's minds? Like you're very well spoken, you have a very sunny personality, but what do you take, either looking back or doing forward? What trait helps people remember you, that helps lead to better opportunities?
I think for me, people tell me that like I'm smiling all the time, so it's like people remember me for that, I guess. But I think a lot of it is like repeated exposure as well, and that's not something like special to me. But the fact that like people, like one time they see me, they might remember me for the second time, but they have a vague impression of me. But then after the second time, like they will remember you, and then after the third time, it's like, oh, you're like this guy who's like smiling, and, like just generally very happy. But yeah, it's like for me personally, it's the sunny disposition that you've identified that I think is what makes me more memorable.
You mentioned frequency. So is that showing up in a certain place at the same time? Is that what does frequency translate to?
I think like yes, not necessarily the same place, but like showing up repeatedly. Like I've been to so many esports events over the years that like people have come to expect me to be there at a certain time, and like maybe the person X I only see like twice a year, but like I make it a point to like say hi to them next time like after the first time I meet them. I'm like, oh hi, it's you again, and I'm not like really trying to get anything from it. I think I talked about like I really hate asking people for things, but like even then, like that does make I think people more likely to like if they have this job or this opportunity or like it's like if they hear like, oh, I do X, and they hear their friends need someone to do X. I was like, hey, you should talk to this guy who does X. I heard this guy does X. Maybe I can refer you. And like maybe I'm not the best person to do X, but like because they have no other like leads, then they'll ask me to do X. Or if I know of someone else better to do X, I'll refer that person to do X, and that person will think of me more positively in the future and like refer me to do other things. But yeah, I've had a ton of situations like that. Like especially like thinking back on it on like my Hearthstone career where I was like a caster, a player, a tournament organizer. I wore a lot of hats, and I was not necessarily always the best person to do any of those one things. But because I was around a lot, people thought of me a lot. And if I did not think I was the best person to do any one of those given things, I would refer people to do that thing, who would like refer me back when another like opportunity came up where I was more equipped or I was better at that particular task.
So it's almost like a level of compound interest in like,
oh yeah,
like in
I've never thought about it that way,
relationships,
but
like like a compound interest of relationships in the like if it's safe to say, I feel like it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and like I don't keep in touch with a lot of people like still from the esports scene, but like I these like contacts like still are useful to this day, right? Like I still like reach out to a lot of like influencers and like just content creators in general and just ask what's up. It's like, oh, I have a question about this. Like just the other day I asked you, hey, what do you know about StarCraft 2 AI bots? Right. And
that's true.
That's a relationship I've made with you over like the past like 10 years or so.
True.
And so the two of us are a great example. Like we don't see each other that often, but we know each other because every time like we do see each other, we say hi, we ask what's up, what's going on with your life, you know?
Yep. Is there something that you think that people should consider when looking to pursue a job in esports or pursue a role in esports? What would be one piece of advice you would impart on somebody that we didn't already cover?
That we didn't already cover. I think it would be, and this is maybe on more of the glass half full perspective, but like I don't think esports is for everyone. And I guess this is the conclusion that I've come to both from my life experience and also from some life experiences of friends that I've talked to in the past. And you have to make sure that at the end of the day, the value that you get from being in the esports industry is worth whatever sacrifices that you have to make, no matter what those might be. And to each individual person, those are individual sacrifices.
You mentioned sacrifices. I would just want to end it up, but I have to know, what was something that you felt that you sacrificed in your path to where you are now?
I wouldn't say that like I necessarily sacrificed it because of the path that I was on, but I spent partially because I was in esports, I spent a long time trying to discover myself. And that was also related to like just me as a person as well. But more so because I was in esports and I was in this like very chaotic situation. I think I had to spend more time discovering myself. I guess it's like the time that I lost, or the time, not that I lost, but the time that I spent there is like a form of sacrifice there, trying to figure out like where do I belong in this space.
You mentioned finding yourself, but like, is that you could not because you weren't super happy in finance, and then you went to esports, which is chaotic, and so was it esports that you were finding yourself, or were you just in general finding out who you were, and esports was just your vehicle to find that out?
Yes, you are much more coherent with what you said than what I said. So yes, that's true.
What did you find out? Have you found yourself?
So I guess one lesson that I did learn, and this is a good way to cap it off, but one lesson that I did learn is where I find happiness is like not necessarily from like material goods or whatever. Where I find happiness is finding a community, number one, and number two, being able to contribute to the community in a positive way. And this not only has to do with like the StarCraft or the RTS community at large, but also my small group of small or medium group of friends. If I can find those niches, if I can find those communities, many people will call this like finding your people, and then being a positive influence on that subgroup of people. I think that is where I find, I guess, my purpose in life, and therefore like my happiness. And that is kind of like my like life mantra in a way going forward.
And that's where Monk is, working with Frost Giant to make the next great RTS. True to his word, you can still find him still engaging with his tribe. And from what I can tell, he's still happy.